and we talked about the Americas from 1200 up to 1750, so the colonial empires, the destruction of the existing American empires like the Aztecs and the Inca. And so what we end up with is what you see on this map. The Spanish, for the most part, have created a large empire throughout the Americas. You have the Portuguese controlling Brazil, and then the northern Atlantic countries pretty much get the scraps. They get some of the Caribbean islands, some of them they're able to take over as a result of wars between European countries, and they get the North American colonies that were not nearly as valuable because the most valuable of the goods that's being produced, if you can't extract precious metals from a colony, would be sugar. And so the sugar producing colonies like Brazil and Jamaica would make far more money for the colonial overlord, the metropole, than a tobacco producing colony like Virginia. And so those valuable colonies are generally held by the Spanish and the Portuguese. So there we go. All right. So the first thing I want to do is take a look at this document, which was written by Simón Bolívar. All right, so let's break this down. Simón Bolívar is a Creole, which means he is of European descent, but he was born in the colonies. He was exiled from his home colony by the Spanish. He's writing this from Jamaica, a British colony, just before the revolutions break out. And so this document is sometimes put on a level with documents like the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of laying out what the Americans think about European rule and what they're looking to get out of a rebellion. And so this does a pretty good job of describing the mercantilist system that we talked about last time. So you have the Americans, it's describing as occupying the lowest positions. They're just serfs destined for labor, he says. He's an American himself, so that's a bit of an exaggeration for people like himself who are Creoles. And so the gulling restrictions, however, were the case. He's describing mercantilism. So you have to buy things from royal monopolies, he describes. And he said, or you have to grow crops that the Europeans want. And so he lists things like indigo, coffee, sugar, chocolate, right? All of those things that the Europeans would want. And he's saying that all of these things that are coming from the colonies could never satisfy the greed of Spain. And so there's this feeling in the colonies that the wealth of the Americas is being taken to the old world and it's benefiting the old world. And there's a lot of truth to this. We can kind of view what's going on in the colonial period as a massive redistribution of wealth. Lots of American gold and silver flowing across the ocean and then off to Spain. Remember, Spain was often just kind of a checkpoint for the gold and silver as it made its way to manufacturing centers like India or China. So let's look at what leads us into that independence period a little bit later on. So the independence movement is really going to get going by about 1820. So we're starting the period 1750, and so we're kind of looking at, well, what is it between 1750 and 1820, or 1750 even in the 1790s, when we see the first real independence movement that's going to spark these independence movements. And so one thing that is inspiring independence movements is the application of mercantilism. And so mercantilism, remember, is this idea that the best thing you can do is enrich the metropole, the home country. And that means you establish colonies simply to serve the needs of the mother country. The colonies are there to provide the raw materials that the mother country needs and to buy the raw material or the manufactured goods that the mother country is producing. So the thing is, though, that mercantilism had been the policy of European countries at this point for a while. I mean, in some European countries, we can say even before the early modern period began, they were practicing some form of mercantilism. And so what's going on here is that we're now in this period in the 1700s into 1800 where European absolute monarchs are increasing the efficiencies of their government. So for the colonies, that means that Europeans are becoming even better at extracting wealth than they were before. They are limiting the top jobs, top political jobs, even to a greater degree than before to the peninsulares. So mercantilism would be felt in kind of a more punishing way by Americans than it would have been maybe before 1750. And so one example of this that we see is the 13 colonies. The British basically hadn't applied mercantilism to the 13 colonies. And then after the 7 Years' War, which ends in the 1760s, they all of a sudden decide they're going to apply mercantilism to the 13 colonies. And the people in 13 colonies are just outraged that this would happen. So what this pairs with then is the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is this European philosophical movement of the 1700s that has taught people that all humans have equal rights. And so the ideas of the Enlightenment then are going to be hostile to these ideas of mercantilism, because the whole philosophy of mercantilism holds that colonies are subordinated to a mother country. In other words, people in the colonies are less than people in the mother country. And so this was a particularly hard sell in places like the 13 colonies where you had a lot of European settlement. So they are called, or what we call settler colonies. So there, the primary objective was not to extract wealth so much as for people to come over and settle for religious reasons or to get land. And so people like George Washington or the lawyers of Boston didn't want to hear that they, just because of an accident of birth, they were accidentally born in these colonies, that they were somehow subordinated to people in England. And so the Enlightenment teaching people that they have the same rights and that people in the colonies and people in Europe are equal is then kind of a revolutionary idea. It's hostile to the status quo. And so as time goes on, what we're going to see is the economic incentive and the philosophical incentive to rebel are going to converge. And so what we would see kind of in the period where we already have the Enlightenment and mercantilism is being applied more stringently than before, the reason we would not see a revolution there is that the Creoles are afraid that if a revolution breaks out, the people at the bottom will turn the world upside down in their view, and they will redistribute private property and end the systems of coercive labor. And so the Creoles then tended to side with the Peninsulares. So even though they hated mercantilism and even though they despised the subordination that went against Enlightenment beliefs, the Creoles needed something to push them into a revolutionary alliance with the people at the bottom of the casta system, the slaves, the Indians, the mestizos, the mulattoes. All right, so the first successful widespread anti-colonial movement is the American Revolution, clearly inspired by the Enlightenment. And Thomas Jefferson is lifting the words of John Locke when he writes that we are after life, liberty, and instead of property, the pursuit of happiness. So the American Revolution then is going to be an inspiration to other Americans because it is applying these Enlightenment ideals. From the outside looking in, it seems that revolutionaries have figured out a way to make the Enlightenment a reality. Up until this time, the Enlightenment was just a bunch of books. It was things that people wrote. It had been applied a little bit to making governments more efficient, but not to overhauling governments altogether. So the Constitution that comes out of the American Revolution begins with the words, "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union. It's a social contract, and it's saying that the government is formed by the people, the legitimacy of the government comes from the people, the authority of the government comes from the people. And so if we combine that with the fact that the Americans in the 13 colonies had rebelled against the British successfully, we can see why this would be an inspiration to other colonies. But it's not really until the French Revolution back in Europe that we see other successful revolutions outside of those 13 colonies. So the French Revolution is going to create even greater instability in the colonial world. Because if you are in a French colony, there are obvious questions about who's in charge. Is the king still in charge? I mean, until he's executed, that could be. Is it the new revolutionary government? Who's actually calling the shots? And then later on, what will happen is Napoleon will seize control in France, and he will replace the king of Spain with one of his brothers, Joseph. And so then if you're in a Spanish colony, there's a question of who are you listening to? Do you listen to the old king of Spain? Do you listen to the new king of Spain? Do you listen to your local leaders? And it kind of breaks down the authority in the area. So the first revolution we want to look at here is the one that breaks out in Haiti. So down at the bottom we see Louverture, who is the former slave who ends up leading the Haitian Revolution. And so Haiti, Saint Domingue, the colony of France, was the richest sugar-producing colony at that point in the world. And so it produced as much wealth as several of the tobacco colonies and the 13 colonies combined. And so for that reason, the French had applied a particularly vicious form of slavery there. So slavery in the Americas, we've discussed, is race-based. It's very difficult to escape. There can be manumission, voluntary freeing of slaves, but it's not as common as in earlier forms of slavery in other regions of the world. And so in Haiti, there are all these stories of abuses of slaves, slaves being branded, slaves at this point still being broken on the wheel, where their legs and their arms would be smashed until they were just jelly and left to die. And so we can see the date 1791. That corresponds with the French promulgating their first revolutionary constitution. So in Haiti, there's this hope that the French Revolution will lead to the abolition of slavery, because the French Revolution is based on Enlightenment ideals. And if everyone's equal, you shouldn't have slaves. Well, Haiti is a moneymaker. The colonial government is cash-strapped. It's relying on planters, these people who own plantations in the colonies, for support, so they don't abolish slavery. And so that, among other things, is what inspires an uprising in Haiti. And so this is led by a former slave. It becomes a slave uprising. And in 1804, it leads to the creation of a free Haitian Republic. So Louverture, by that point, had been betrayed to the French and taken prisoner. He died in a French prison in France. And yet he's still a powerful symbol for the revolution. And so in 1804, we have a few things going on then with Haiti. So one is this example of another anti-colonial revolution that's successful. But then we have the fact that it's led by former slaves and people who were slaves at the time they rose up. And that is exactly what the Creoles want to avoid, because what ends up happening in Haiti is that the people who are at the bottom are now at the top. The former slaves are going to look to redistribute the land because they don't have any themselves. It makes sense. They were working on the plantations. The thinking is, shouldn't they get land from the plantations? But this is what inspires the Creoles to side with mestizos, mulattoes, Africans, Indians. And so it's not like everybody just decides all at once, let's make this bargain where we're going to team up together. This is a system where both sides stand to get something out of it, right? So if you're the lower class, what you would want is the abolition of the casta system, of slavery and the casta system. If you are the Creole class, you want political power. And so what's going to happen is these Creoles, who were often military officers, are going to lead the revolutionary forces. They're going to come out of this, in most cases, as the leaders of independent countries, and so they'll get what they want, their preservation of private property and their political power. And on the other side of this, we have mestizos and Indians who are freed from the caste system, and in most of the newly independent countries, slavery is abolished. So here is a second part of this letter from Jamaica from Simon Bolivar. So now looking at the fact that he's a Creole and he's an army officer has new meaning, right? So what we see is that he is talking about where Latin America will go, where the Americas will go after independence. And he, in other parts of the letter, talks about how he admires the system created by the 13 colonies, this creation of a republic. But here he says that he cannot persuade himself that the New World can, at the moment, be organized as a great republic. So he it basically has two meanings here. One is he does not think that the American states can be unified in a continental power, which was one vision. We talked a lot over the course about ways of defining nationalism. And so this is more or less pre-nationalism. It's during the birth of nationalism, but we can see some elements of that. Do they want one giant country of South America? Do they want large countries in the North and the South that unite most of the colonies in the North and most of the colonial people in the South? Or do they want smaller countries that reflect more regional interests? And so Simón Bolívar is saying it can't be one giant country of South America. And so then he goes on to say, the American states need the care of paternal governments to heal the sores and wounds of despotism and war. So here he is claiming that you need some kind of leader who knows better than the average person how to heal the country. And so by this, he, of course, means Creoles, people like himself who are educated, who have the training to run the government. And he says, in a way, this is temporary. They're just going to recover from the Revolutionary Wars, which were devastating. When slaves rebelled against the silver mine owners, for instance, they tended to destroy the infrastructure that enabled the colony to extract silver. So Simón Bolívar is saying, we need somebody who knows best to call the shots and help us recover from that. And so he does not want a republic. He does not want democracy. He doesn't think Latin America is ready for it. And he thinks instead you need some kind of enlightened dictator who's going to run the country. And he pretty much sees himself in that kind of role as a Creole. So let's look at what comes after this. So we have Creole leadership teaming up with the mestizos, mulattoes, Indians, Africans, who in the casta system were at the bottom. And so again, they've got this situation where both get something out of this, but the Creoles as leaders works really well because, again, they tended to be high-level military officers. So they couldn't have the highest level positions in the colony. Peninsulares dominated those. But they had a lot of responsibility. And so they used that against the Spanish here and against the Portuguese, against the French in different colonies. And so you do end up with colonies that become independent countries, often with people like Simón Bolívar as the new leaders. So if you look at the map on the right, the top map on the right has Bolívar and San Martín, two Creole officers fighting for independence. They fought separately in the north and the south and eventually then teamed up. San Martín relinquished his forces to Bolívar, and they basically drive the Spanish out of South America. And so you can see in the lower map that what they attempt to do at first is create a large country of Gran Colombia, which includes today Colombia, but also Venezuela and Ecuador. So it's more than one country. It's eventually going to split apart. And you can see Bolivia there in the center, named after Simón Bolívar. So this is successful. So one of the early examples of this is in Mexico. There is a priest, Miguel Hidalgo. He's a Creole. He is able to get a lot of people of Indian descent on his side, leads a march against the Spanish. Now the march fails. Hidalgo is eventually captured and executed, but he becomes a symbol, sort of like Louverture in Haiti. And so eventually Mexico is going to achieve its independence under Creole leadership, a general Iturbide, an officer Iturbide. All right, now what happens afterwards? Remember Simón Bolivar talking about how the Spanish are stealing all their stuff. They're so greedy. They're taking all of that wealth. And so the thinking there is that if we can get the Spanish out, we'll be able to keep all that wealth, and everybody will be better off. Everybody will be wealthy. And that's not what happens. And so what we are looking at here with that table 6 is they've kind of normed GDP at that time. And you can see that several of those colonies had a per capita level of GDP that was far lower than what we would have found in the United States at the same time, or in Western Europe at the same time. And so kind of the bigger picture here is that in the United States, because it was established as a European settler colony, land ownership tended to be far more widespread. The majority, at least, of the people who come to be citizens of the United States, white men, were landowners or were otherwise owners of property, owners of a shop. And so that was not the case in most of the former Spanish colonies. And so what we're looking at here is kind of a difference in the purpose of the colony. So since the 13 colonies had a climate that was closer to that of Europe, it ends up being a settlement colony. It also doesn't really have many resources that the Europeans want. And so the British attitude is more or less, who cares if the people in Boston create their own shipping companies and they don't use the mother country's shipping? Who cares? Boston doesn't have anything of value anyway. And so that ultimately is to the benefit of the United States. Not being as economically valuable for the British means that the British allow the United States to develop an independent economy. That's not what happens in places like Venezuela or in Brazil, right? Brazil, you can see the per capita is a little bit higher. There's kind of a different path taken by Brazil. You can see on the map, it's called the Empire of Brazil. It basically stays a possession of the Portuguese royal family. And so while there is technically a transfer of power, so the king of Portugal cedes Brazil to his son, it's more or less still under the same family. So there's very little disruption that happens there. Brazil also has a lot of sugar and a lot of gold. And so that is what's pushing that wealth up. But generally speaking, we're looking at lower numbers there. So if we're looking at the instability, one of the things that we can see as a cause is that areas where European mercantilism was very strictly applied, areas that were forced to provide raw materials to the mother country and to buy manufactured goods from the mother country, are going to have a very difficult time achieving economic independence. And the graph at the bottom shows this. British textiles to Latin America, you could see that the British textiles to Latin America, it's basically the vast majority of what the British are exporting. So this is at the same time that Britain is industrializing. And so it's in the British interest if all of these colonies break away from Spain and Portugal and France, because they can then buy British goods because they won't be in a mercantilist system. But if we take this from the Mexican perspective, while Mexico becomes politically independent, its economy looks much the same after independence as it did before. Instead of shipping all these goods off to Spain, the Mexicans are shipping them to Britain. And so that becomes a very difficult pattern to break. The other thing is that in areas that are exploited under a mercantilist system, the Europeans tend to impose a more dictatorial government. And that's another difficult pattern to break. If a group of people is used to one-man rule, then it can be very challenging to transition to democracy, as democracy is messy. Democracy can be slow, and you can debate, and things that you think should happen very quickly don't happen quickly. And in areas where they're used to one-man rule and somebody making a decision very quickly and solving problems very quickly, that can lead to frustration and just overthrowing the system. And it also leads to political parties that are based around one person and that person's personality more than any kind of ideology. I mean, they don't have a liberal party really, or a conservative party. They had parties called liberal and conservative parties, but they often were based around one person and that person's ability to help you personally, help you with your own economic situation. So there's going to be this period of instability from independence until we get to the period right after 1850. And so they're rebuilding, they're kind of restructuring, and so then let's look at what's happening here. This is a passage written by a modern historian. So what we were looking at here is, you can see the period between 1897 and 1930. So big picture. That's going to correspond with the second industrial revolution in Western Europe and the United States. So the second industrial revolution is when we have development of electrical generators and internal combustion engines, and kind of broadly speaking, we would see at that time communication networks like railroads and telegraph lines be far more significant than they would have been earlier on. And so the situation kind of globally is that European and American investors have the ability to reach areas that they wouldn't have been able to easily reach before and invest in those areas. And so we see here the impact on Cuba. So it says the period between 1897 and 1930, Second Industrial Revolution, saw the enormous concentration of latifundia, so sort of like plantations, in the Caribbean under the stimulus of American investment, capital investment. So the United States at this point has become one of the industrial leaders. In that period we're looking at, 1897 and 1930, the United States is going to eventually be the leader, the global leader in productivity period, so surpassing the British. And so if we go back to 1897, they're right there with the British, they're right there with Germany. The combined acreage of 6 plantations operated by the Cuban American Sugar Company, so an American transnational company, totaled 500,000 acres. So what we're seeing here, kind of with these numbers, tells us that while Cuba at this point was technically independent, really the Cuban economy is controlled by the United States. And so that limits independence. And so we can see that what Cuba is producing is raw materials that are consumer goods that are going to benefit people back in the United States, sugar and bananas. All right, so then it gets down to the key to this American concentration of production was the railway, right? Because the railway enables the American companies, it says, to kind of string together all of the productive areas and extract those areas. So what that means for the Cubans is that the railway network tends to go from the interior to the coast, and it does not tend to connect populated centers within Cuba. So while railways are being built and the Americans can pat themselves in the back and say that industrial technology is being introduced to Cuba because of American investment, and that they would think of themselves as bringing civilization and the kind of white man's burden type of terminology of the day. Even though they're saying that, really the railway network is benefiting Americans. And so it says in the region where all the railways are being built, you have 70% of Cuba's mills, and the land that produced 60% of the island's crops. And so it's kind of the transition we're looking at once industrialization catches on throughout the Western world. So places like Cuba are going to be caught up in this global capitalist system, this consumer-based system in the Americas. So that period of industrialization in the Americas is going to lead to increased demand for Latin American goods, Latin American raw materials. And so this period from about 1870 through 1914 is referred to as the Great Boom. Latin American economies take off. And so again, we want to connect this to industrialization. Industrialization is occurring at this point in places like the United States and Western Europe. And what industrialization does is it creates a larger middle class in those areas. That middle class is wealthy and can afford lots of consumer goods. By the time we get to the second industrial revolution, 1870, even working class people in Western Europe and the United States would have enough money to afford some of the cheaper consumer goods like coffee. And so industrialization is a key in that way. It's creating a large group of consumers who can afford to buy goods coming from Latin America. It makes it cheaper to ship those goods from Latin America. And so refrigeration is developed during this time. And we talked about how that first refrigeration involved cutting giant blocks of ice from colder areas in the mountains or areas in Canada, and lining cars, train cars, or steamships with these giant blocks of ice. And so that means that even perishable goods, fruit and beef even, can be transported long distances as a result of industrialization. And so the big picture here is that as a result of industrialization, you have these consumers in the United States that want to buy products coming from places like Latin America as cheaply as they possibly can. And so that's where we fit in this global capitalist model. So capitalism, remember, is an economic system that is based around free market and free trade. The idea is, if you have free market, if you have free trade, if you have competition between businesses, what that does is it creates an economic situation where there will be cheaper products at a high quality for consumers. So if we're looking at this in a global way, what we're saying is that companies that are capitalist operating from the United States are going to try to maximize their profit. So profit is the gap between the price of the good, so what you can obtain in selling the good, and what it costs you to produce the good. And so one way to enhance your profit, that gap, is by pushing down the cost of production. And so if you can find a cheaper labor source, then you can generate more profit. And so producing sugar in Cuba on these latifundia is preferable then to producing it maybe in an area where the labor would be free. Free labor can charge more. So producing it in the United States then would be less profitable because workers in the United States are going to earn more than you can charge a worker, or you can pay a worker in southern Mexico. And so we can see that overall on the comparative levels of GDP per capita, per person, that wealth is going up, and in some cases it is going up in a drastic way. And so there are states on there that you can see, like Argentina, that are becoming tremendously wealthy. Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world by 1913. It is generating as much wealth as some states that were partially industrialized, like Italy. And so the result of that is a lot of Europeans are going to look to move to places like Argentina. Argentina is in the southern part of South America, so it has a climate that's more like the European climate. And so you can see on the two graphs, the European immigration to Argentina by nationality on the southern graph there. And so lots of people coming from especially poor southern areas of Europe, areas that remained more or less agricultural during this time. And we can also see that because of global capitalism in the Americas, they're relying on new forms of what we would call semi-coerced labor. And so the graph there to the right, entitled Routes, shows the indentured servants being brought by people brought from areas like India or China to the Caribbean, that Caribbean region, and used to produce sugar. And so once slavery is abolished, and it is abolished in the United States for good following the Civil War, 1865. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. This doesn't end the push for cheap coerced labor. And so indentured servitude is kind of a stopgap. In Africa, we would see more or less slavery under a new name in this time period. All right, so what that inspires Latin American countries to do is to shift to an export-led system. Now, an export-led system can be a manufacturing system, which is what we would see in Japan by about 1900. It would be an export-led manufacturing system. Here, what we were talking about is an export-led system that tended to focus on raw materials, consumer raw materials, so sugar and coffee and beef, among other things. And the exports are often going to be dominated by companies that are based outside of Latin America. So we've already looked at the companies in Cuba that were based in the United States. The United Fruit Company was one of them. All right, so this export-led system is great if demand is high, but it is terrible if demand comes crashing down, because it means that you have nothing else you can rely upon. And so the period of the second industrial revolution is going to be a period where demand is high, right? As wealth is being generated in places like the United States, and as the workers are better off, and as the European middle class is growing, then there's going to be this high demand. So the situation, though, after 1914, when World War I breaks out, is going to be very different, because all of a sudden then demand is going to come crashing down, and if you are dependent on one good, then you're just out of luck, right? There's no other way to fill in the gaps. Whereas in the United States, which we keep coming back to as having taken a different path, we can see the level of industrialization there. And so it's not in this period reaching the level of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of Britain, but it is still pretty high. All right, so the Americans then, if demand comes crashing down, can produce goods that they need. Places like Argentina could not. So we looked at the migration. We're going to have a migration that is voluntary, which is the case in Argentina, and migration that is less voluntary. So indentured servants were often enticed to sign a contract in misleading ways. They were promised compensation that they never saw, or promised that the term of labor would be shorter than it actually would be, that it would be easier to return. And so that's why we refer to this as semi-coerced. And technically, these people were buying into it voluntarily, but often no. So through 1900, this is a system that's working pretty well for Latin America. But kind of the bottom line problems that we just described are, your economy is really dominated by some outside group in some other country, and you are dependent on the demand for one particular product on the global market. Wealth is being concentrated in the hands of European American companies and the for the Latin Americans in the hands of the landowners. And we already said that there was this uneven distribution of wealth in the Americas. All right, so that gets us to the end of the Americas.